Professor jointly appointed in the Department of Science and Technology Studies. We're delighted to have with us for our Repi Institute seminar today, Dr. Ali Fatollah Nejad. He is a German-Iranian political scientist and author working at the intersection of Middle East politics, international relations, and development studies. He is founder and director of the Center for Middle East and Global Order, a research network and voluntary-based think tank devoted to exploring regional and global transformations while promoting a new Western foreign policy that reconciles interests and values. He teaches Middle East politics and international security at the Hertie School at the University of Governance in Berlin. He's the author of many publications, very prolific. His most recent book, entitled Iran, How the West is Betraying Its Values and Interests, was recognized by Der Tagesspiegel Daily as one of the 10 best books of the spring of 2025. We're very much looking forward to the talk. We'll have Dr. Ali Fatollah Nejad speak for about 40 minutes or so, 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. We'll hold the questions for the end. If you have questions, you can put up a hand and we'll take the questions at the end as they come. Okay, I'll turn it over to our guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Slayton, for the very kind invitation and also introduction. I hope you're all hearing me well. I'm very honored to be with you. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is to tell you a bit about my research over the last decade, but especially over the last few years. This is also a book project that I'm currently working on in English, which is somehow based in the German language book that was, mentioned by Professor Slayton, that was published earlier this year. And for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to focus on two areas. And as the title suggests, an Islamic emperor without clothes. My main argument is that when it comes to the Islamic Republic of Iran, we can see that there is now an Islamic emperor without clothes, both internally but also regionally. And so I'm gonna, explain the reasons why, this is the case in my view. So in the first step, I'm going to talk about the domestic conditions of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Secondly, I'm going to focus on the so-called unraveling of the axis of resistance, which is this Iranian-led network in the Middle East, especially over the course of 2024. And by so doing, I'm challenging, a number of dominant assumptions that have been, there for the last years, if not more, in Iran-related analysis when it comes to the issue of domestic stability or domestic regime stability in Iran, for instance, but also when it comes to Iran's regional power and influence. En passant, I'm gonna, mention some of those assumptions that I'm challenging. Let's start with the domestic arena, which I consider to be, indispensable to understand before one could go over and try to understand a state's foreign policy. I think this mantra that foreign policy is also domestic politics also applies to a number of cases, both in democratic and non-democratic contexts. In authoritarian contexts, I would argue that this is even more pivotal because not only because of state-society relations, but because of the nature of the state and also of the elite and what kind of interests are driving elite behavior, both in the domestic context but also in external policies. And as you will see from my talk, I have potentially a different angle toward analyzing regional geopolitics and foreign policy. Someone who has done his PhD in development studies. I particularly look at the domestic context especially socioeconomic developments, but also other developmental issues. And I think such developmental issues are also quite important in order to understand whether, a state is resilient, stable, or not. I've suggested since 2018 that what we are witnessing in the Iranian case is the start of a long-term revolutionary process, a process that was kicked off by novel forms of nationwide uprisings, the first of which being at the turn of the year 2017-18, the so-called day protests, and the day, refers to the Persian name of the calendar month. And because why novel kind of protest? Because for the first time, the lower classes that were hitherto considered to be a loyal social base of the Islamic Republic had taken to the streets en masse, chanting slogans, revolutionary ones, against all components of the Islamic Republic. That is against both the military component, which is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps or the IRGC, that is not only the Praetorian Guard of the regime and the most important military and intelligence organization, but it's also an entity that has evolved into potentially the most important economic player in Iran. And slogans directed against the ruling Shia clergy that since the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran has played a huge role in terms of ruling the country. But for the first time, slogans were directed at both main political factions of the establishment, not only against the so-called hardliners, but for the first time also against the so-called reformists. So this precise faction that has been for long been, considered as a potential agent of change from above. But what those protests showed, and why they also constituted a shock moment for the elite, was the fact that, first of all, the lower classes had abandoned this perceived kind of loyalty vis-à-vis the regime, and also the reformists have been heavily criticized by this popular revolt. We've seen that this protest was kicked off by the social question, but it got immediately politicized, and we saw protests all over the country in around 100 cities. The de facto continuation of this protest wave was in November 2019, again triggered by the social question, this time around a tripling of the fuel prices overnight, which again led to a huge, national revolt, again in over 100 cities. This time around with a higher participation according to Interior Ministry figures, while at the turn of the year 2017-18 we've had 50,000 people participating in those protests. In November 2019 it was 200,000. The state reacted with the internet blackout, during which probably in half a week, around 1,500 demonstrators were killed. Hence, those protests and the bloody repression by the state would be, known as the Bloody November, and become a traumatic event, of course, for many Iranians. But in both cases, the protests were driven by the lower classes, but also by the middle class poor, especially in November 2019. So this is the social science category of those with middle class, qualifications. That is, they have university degrees and have concomitant expectations regarding social mobility, but who end up socioeconomically poor or deprived because of the lack of possibilities within the political economic system in Iran. So in other words, people who have university degrees but end up in less paid jobs, and because in the Iranian case they're also not part of the elite clans that have preferential kind of access to, social mobility, to other kinds of resources. Precisely the same social base that we could observe during the Arab uprisings. The lower classes, but also the middle class poor. The latter, one of the latter's representative was, of course, Bouazizi, whose self-immolation set off the Arab Spring in the first place at the end of 2010. So also in both cases, in during those two Iranian protest waves, um, the protest could be crushed after about 2 weeks. Um, then we had the erstwhile culmination of this process with the Revolutionary Women Life Freedom Uprising, which I'm sure all of you have heard about, which happened in the fall of 2022. So that is 3 years ago. And this time around, the trigger was not a social question or higher food prices or fuel prices, but it was a sociocultural issue, which was basically the state murder of a young Kurdish Iranian woman because of her alleged non-adherence to the state-imposed hijab laws. And this triggered a nationwide uprising in all corners of the country, but this time around with a stronger dimension, with estimates suggesting that at least 2 million Iranians partook in this wave of protests. Again, with very clear revolutionary slogans demanding basically a regime change from within and the end of dictatorship in the Islamic Republic of Iran. And yet, this time around, the protest wave was repressed only after 3.5 months, which is also testament to the fact that the social base this time around was larger. So there were also other sections from Iran's middle class, but also even in more affluent areas and neighborhoods of the capital city, Tehran, we've witnessed protests. At the forefront of these protests were women, but also Iran's Gen Z that for the first time appeared on the political stage. And the very fact that also this uprising did not lead to major changes and was also repressed is partly due to the fact that what we call in Persian, in terms of a social science category, the gray social class did not partake in the street protests. That is the kind of social group that is sympathetic to revolutionary uprisings against the regime, but did not join them on the streets because they still fear that they have something to lose, and they do ask what kind of plan B there is, what kind of economic and also political vision there is beyond the Islamic Republic. So obviously the issue of organization and the lack of an oppositional organization within Iran is something that is also contributing to the failure of those uprisings. But as I suggest, we're talking about a long-term revolutionary process, so we have to look at a wider context. And these uprisings that we've seen over the last half a decade or so, or even more in Iran, are fueled by a structural crisis, a quadruple one that is, homegrown, that is structural. And the first crisis is the socioeconomic crisis, which leaves the bulk of the Iranian population in poverty. Do not forget that on paper, Iran should be one of the richest countries on the planet, at least being, among the G20, if not even higher ranked. In terms of resources, if you take oil and gas together, Iran is ranked number 2 in the world. So there are tremendous wealth that this country possesses. But still, we've seen over the last 1 or 2 decades, even within the Iranian middle class, a hollowing out process that, as I said, leaves the bulk of the population today mired in poverty. This socioeconomic crisis has dimensions such as high inflation. So, over the last half a decade, we had a an inflation rate on average of 45%. Now, this inflation rate is expected to significantly get higher because of the reimposition of UN sanctions on Iran. And you have and this socioeconomic crisis is also a consequence of the political economy of the macro economy, also macroeconomic crisis of the country. An economic crisis that is primarily domestically produced because Iran is one of the top countries in terms of rankings in corruption indices. Mismanagement, nepotism are huge problems in Iran. You have a political elite that also monopolizes economic power. So you have, different facets of this economic crisis that has been around for many, many years in Iran and that has been aggravated by foreign sanctions, but which did not come about as a result primarily of foreign sanctions. Secondly, we have an ecological crisis that is undermining the livelihoods of tens of millions of Iranians, that is also aggravated over the years within a Middle East region that, compared to other world regions, is one of the most, is the most water stressed one. Water stress is one of the problems of the ecological crisis in Iran. You have other layers of this multifaceted ecological crisis that over the years has time and again led to politicized and political protests, and which also is, as I said, homegrown because of mal-decisions of the elite, many of them being short short-term profit oriented kind of decisions in terms of building industries and areas which do not make sense from an ecological point of view. And thirdly, we have the gender gap, that is quite politically explosive, as we've seen in the fall of 22 with the Women Life Freedom Uprising in Iran, which also has different facets. One of them of this kind of gender discrimination is a socioeconomic discrimination of women, with women in Iran on average and in the younger generation, among the younger generation, suffering from a unemployment rate that is double as high as as for men, and also with a working force participation of only one-fifth that of men. And also, when it comes to graduate unemployment, the rate of women is double that of men. In universities where women at least are as much educated as their male counterparts. You have obviously illegal discrimination, de facto gender apartheid, that was created and established right after the 1979 revolution, which is that women do not count, only count half the man before court. On several legal levels, there is this kind of discrimination against them. There is the sociocultural discrimination, that is the state imposed hijab laws, the state's willingness to control the lifestyles and bodies of women. And as one, by the way, of the indispensable pillars of the Islamic Republic in terms of political ideology. And you have a political discrimination within a political system that is patriarchal, that is run by men, very old men. And occasionally you would see one Iranian vice president that is female, but within the system where not even the president is really a very important figure. So imagine what, the power and influence of one vice president would be. So there is also political discrimination against women. So you have this multi-layered discrimination against half of the Iranian population. And last but not least, you have the political crisis that is the center of gravity within this quadruple crisis. And this political crisis is characterized by a regime in its entirety that is losing a lot of its popular legitimacy. That is reflected in the parliamentary and presidential election results over the last decade, which see every time a new record low when it comes to the participation rate, including the collapse of the legitimacy of the reformist faction, which I said, earlier, was long considered to be a potential agent of change from below. You have a highly repressive system. Iran has the highest execution rate on the planet for many years now. You have an exclusively Islamist political spectrum where the bulk of Iranian political culture basically is excluded from it. You have a highly corrupt, highly power monopolizing, both economic, military, and political kind of elite that is running the country. And you have also per institutional arrangement, and because of the dominance of the so-called theological pillar over the other pillar of the institutional system, that is normally referred to as a Republican pillar, but which, in my view, can at best be described as a semi-Republican pillar. So that very pillar that includes direct popular vote for the president or the parliament. This kind of pillar is heavily dominated by the theocratic pillar. So those unelected bodies that can actually pre-select candidates for the presidency and the parliament. So institutionally speaking, and also because of the collapse of the legitimacy of the reformists, the Islamic Republic political system has turned out to be not, prone to reform. So reform within the system has become increasingly elusive. Hence also the increasingly revolutionary kind of outlook of the most recent protests waves in Iran. So you have this, structural crisis, this quadruple crisis that is the driving force for revolutionary, protests in Iran. And importantly, the political crisis also suggests that the elite does not have any kind of policy answers to any of those crises that I've mentioned. So this is, something that is, in fact, leading to a domestic situation for some years now, where you have, in my view, an irreconcilable gulf between state and society. Both sides being sociologically very different from each other. On one side, as we've said, there is this kind of patriarchal system that is very provincial and corrupt. And you have, on the other side, you have a society that has gone through a process of secularization over the decades that has also very modernized and that is very globalized in its outlook, and who has very different aspirations than the ideologues of the regime would suggest. And what I argue is that both sides therefore find themselves on collision course. Because the regime cannot really cater to the basic needs of the population, and there is really no, common denominator between the two, culturally, politically, economically, and so forth. And also importantly, the kind of relationship between the poor in the Islamic Republic and the Islamic Republic as a political system that has over the years evolved into an oligarchy has dramatically shifted with, as suggested earlier, the lower classes no more being a loyal social base. So that at the end of the day, what we witness in the context of the Islamic Republic of Iran is a system that is dying, but there's nothing, new yet that can emerge. So we are in this kind of in-between phase where there's a lot of opposition vis-a-vis the regime. Probably 80% of the population do oppose it. But there is no, as I said, there is no organized opposition. There is no leadership figures. And then as such, it's not clear what would come after a potential collapse of the Islamic Republic. So this is the kind of, picture what I can see from the domestic situation, a picture that is heavily also challenging our long-held assumptions in wider Middle Eastern studies, but also very much applied to the Iranian case over the years, of authoritarian stability. So that is the idea that dictatorships and autocratic regimes can best can best provide for stability. And I think because of, at least the Iranian case would suggest that authoritarian stability and resilience in the Iranian case is actually quite fragile. Plus the fact, which is also contributing to the fragility of autocratic, stability, is something that's going to bring me to the second part, which is the very fact that the power center of the Islamic Republic of Iran is penetrated by none less than the enemy that is the Israelis. So, in other words, by Israel's intelligence service. So, how can a system, an autocratic system, be stable when you have such a situation, when you have this deep penetration of the Israeli Mossad into the power center of the Islamic Republic, the power center being defined as, being part of it as the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, who is the de facto state leader, the religious, political, and military leader of the country, plus his quasi parallel government, his so-called court, that has thousands of employees, plus the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So those entities, they form the power center, and this power center is heavily infiltrated. Now, as I said, this brings us to the second dimension of why I argue that the Islamic Republic has now become an Islamic empire without clothes, because of the fact that this powerful axis of resistance, and this was our understanding for many years, this kind of network in the Middle East, composed of militias, but also the Syrian state under Bashar al-Assad, those pro-Iranian groups and entities. This axis of resistance has dramatically unraveled in the course of the war in the Middle East following October 7th, 2023. And so what we have seen is that the Israelis, because of their different kind of threat perception that they have developed because of October 7th regarding the Islamic Republic of Iran, probably not only as merely a veritable threat, but perhaps even an existential one. Iran, together with its allies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and others, has embarked on a campaign, including a campaign of destruction, basically, against the axis of resistance, including targeted killings against the top commanders of the trio IRGC, Hamas and Hezbollah, starting at the outset of the year 2024, then culminating in the summer of that year with the targeted assassination of Hamas Politburo chief Ismail Haniyeh in the heart of Tehran on the very day of the inauguration of the new Iranian president Masoud Pezeshkian. Haniyeh was killed in his IRGC-controlled compound in the middle of Tehran. And then, more importantly, as we entered the second phase of the war, according to then Israeli Defense Minister, we've seen, the destruction of the crown jewel within this Iran-led axis of resistance, Hezbollah, in September of that year in two acts. The first act being, those walkie-talkie and pager attacks against thousands of Hezbollah fighters. And in a second act, this Israeli bombing of an underground headquarters of Hezbollah, killing the very charismatic Secretary General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. So Israel's campaign to decapitate the military command of Hezbollah, but also thereby also destroy the missile infrastructures of Hezbollah, also the financial assets of Hezbollah. So what we've seen is in September of that year is truly momentous in terms of its analytical significance. By that time, it was clear that what we are witnessing is an unraveling of the axis of resistance with the very iron fist that the Iranians had, de facto positioned at the doorstep of Israel with a missile arsenal of 150 to 200,000 being directed at Israel and long serving as Iranian deterrence against Israeli aggression. This scenario has collapsed, and only because of this situation. Later on in December of last year, of 2024, we could see the 10 or 11-day collapse of the Assad regime in Syria because of Iran's weakness, of the IRGC weakness, and because of Hezbollah's weakness, um, and also because of Russia's preoccupation with its war on Ukraine. I mean, all those forces had come to Assad's aid following the Arab uprising in his country a decade earlier, by the mid-2010s, when Iran, Hezbollah, and others on the ground protected the Assad regime from being toppled back then, and the Russians did so from the air. So this situation was no more there. Assad therefore collapsed. And now we see that this kind of gigantic and powerful axis of resistance has more or less collapsed. The only disruptive member of that axis remains the so-called Ansar Allah movement, or the Houthis in Yemen, that have engaged in, in attacking international shipping in the Red Sea, but also Israel directly since October 7th, 2023. But because of their geographical distance to Iranian borders, they cannot replace, the Assad regime, Hezbollah, or even powerful pro-Iranian militias in Iraq. So Iran's entire regional strategy of employing the axis of resistance in a kind of a forward defense strategy to keep wars distant from Iranian borders, to let those axis members fight on Iran's behalf against Israel or the United States, did not work out actually in the post-October 7th geopolitical environment. So that this entire strategy and this so-called strategic depth of Iran does not exist anymore. With also Syria under Assad gone, this is also preventing Iran from rearming Hezbollah because, after all, Syria served as a land route toward military supplies to Hezbollah, but also other entities, in the Levant. This is a wholly new situation if you look at it. I mean, it's a huge change of historic proportions, what we've witnessed in the course of the year 2024, with the unraveling of this axis of resistance, with the basically destruction of Hezbollah, most notably. And this unraveling process has multiple analytical dimensions. It is a political ideological failure because it has led to a lot of frustration within the Iranian regime's hardline support base inside the country, but also the regional supporter base of the Islamic Republic, because they've seen the immense gulf separating harsh rhetoric coming out of Tehran to confront Israel on one hand, and some kind of military reluctance on the ground. This credibility problem, led to a number of Iranian military reactions somehow. For instance, the two first military confrontations and Iranian attacks against Israel in April and October of 2024, which came about as a result of this credibility problem that they've had. So they had to show some strength. This is why those assaults by the Iranians were pre-communicated to the other side well in advance, also signaling Iranian distaste to provoke an all-out great war that would pit Iran against Israel and or the United States, a war that it could possibly not win and would heavily jeopardize regime stability and survival within a regime. And do not forget that is an oligarchic one by now. So this is also a regime that is not really prone to great wars because it could lose all those amassed wealth. So this is also a major analytical kind of factor behind Iranian reluctance, but because of this political ideological problem, they were somehow forced to react. Secondly, it's a military failure because of the things that we've already mentioned. There is, and the most important dimension is probably the intelligence one, which we also mentioned, which is the penetration by Mossad of Iran's power center. An intelligence penetration that goes beyond Iranian borders and also reaches into Iran's regional arm of the IRGC and also Iran's allies and proxies in the region. So this is a multi-layered problem that the Iranians, are struggling with. Of course, they would like to rebuild the axis of resistance, but it's going to be a very difficult ride because of various factors. So, in other words, what we are witnessing here, and I'm going to come to a close, is that the long time suggestion about Iranian also regional prowess has been misleading because at least because of the developments since 24. So that also regionally speaking, the Islamic Republic has become an emperor without clothes, and it hasn't the kind of bargaining chips that it long had also to be used in negotiations with the West, most notably its axis of resistance. So Iran's, power of nuisance, if you like, in the region. So this doesn't exist anymore. Hezbollah as a deterrent and iron fist is also not existing anymore. The nuclear program has been heavily damaged by the 12-day war this June between Iran and Israel, and and later the United States. So the nuclear program is also not readily available anymore as a major bargaining chip. And the last bargaining chip was Iran's expanding missile program that was also heavily destroyed by Israel. So this is why since 24 and aggravated with the June 12-day war this year, the Islamic Republic of Iran finds itself in a state of strategic perplexity because which is compounded by the fact that its supreme leader Ali Khamenei had fled to a bunker during the war. So, and this was tremendously costly for his authority, a central figure in Iranian politics for decades, which does not exist anymore. So this is one facet of this newfound strategic perplexity. The second facet, as I said, is the lack of Iranian bargaining chips and leverage that they used to have, and which they used to operate with, also on the diplomatic arena. So it's a very uncertain situation in which the Islamic Republic finds itself now, 46 years after the revolution, a situation that some regime figures fear could evolve into a so-called Syrianization of Iran. What is meant here? What is basically meant is that also with the reimposition of UN sanctions, aggravating the homemade economic crisis in Iran, with skyrocketing inflation rates, fearing to achieve 90%, we could see that this aggravated economic crisis is not allowing the state to properly pay its repressive apparatus, something that we've seen in the case of the armed forces in Syria that were not really paid. This is why they didn't actually fight in December of 24. And also, this economic crisis aggravating the financial situation, the economic situation of the rank and file of Iran's armed forces, including the IRGC, the rank and file that is important to repress the next uprising. And the question is, and if you think about 90% inflation, it's going to eat up, a lot of the privileges that some of those soldiers may have. So this is something, a great concern that this aggravated economic crisis not only to lead to some kind of socioeconomic rifts within the security apparatus, but an economic crisis that is also signaling the message to the majority of the Iranian population, including those of the so-called gray social stratum, that whatever comes after the Islamic Republic is better than the present situation. So an understanding that life is becoming increasingly miserable under the present conditions, and that anything other than the Islamic Republic may be good. So this is one of the scenarios that we may be witnessing down the road. But at this point, I'm gonna thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.